In the grand halls of power, madness often hides behind velvet curtains and golden crowns. But rarely does it take a form as absurd and tragic as this. This is the true story of a king, wealthy, indulgent, and wildly eccentric, whose obsession with food turned fatal. A monarch not assassinated by his enemies, nor slain in battle, but brought down by his own gluttony. This is the story of King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden, the mad king who ate himself to death. Adolf Fredrik was never meant to be a powerful king. Born in 1710 into a minor German noble family, he was elevated to the throne of Sweden during a time of deep political turmoil and transformation. The Swedish monarchy had been weakened following the country's disastrous involvement in the Great Northern War. Real political power now rested with the Riksdag, the parliament, and the role of king had become largely ceremonial, a puppet throne dressed in royal robes. And so, when the Riksdag selected Adolf Fredrik as king in 1751, it wasn't because he was a visionary or a leader of extraordinary talent. It was because he was malleable, agreeable, and frankly, easy to control. But what Adolf Fredrik lacked in political influence, he made up for in personal appetite. He was known as a kind, soft-spoken man, rarely given to the arrogance or bloodthirstiness that plagued other monarchs. He enjoyed the simple pleasures of life, especially food. For many rulers, pleasure was found in the pursuit of power, conquest, and legacy. For Adolf Fredrik, pleasure was something more immediate, more tangible. It came on a plate, in a glass, and above all, in the sweet taste of semla. His court quickly became known for its opulent feasts and indulgent meals. While the country was grappling with economic inequality and political division, the royal kitchen was churning out lavish spreads that would have made a Roman emperor blush. From the finest imported lobsters to rare spices and wines, Adolf Fredrik spared no expense in satisfying his culinary cravings. Servants and chefs in the royal household came to understand his rhythms. Breakfasts that blended into lunches, lunches that flowed into dinners, and desserts that never came in just one serving. Meals weren't just sustenance for the king. They were an event, a ritual, a joy. At the heart of this passion was a dessert that would one day become synonymous with his name, the semla. This Swedish pastry, soft and golden, filled with almond paste and topped with clouds of whipped cream, was traditionally eaten only on Shrove Tuesday, the day before Lent began. But for Adolf Fredrik, tradition was merely a suggestion. He ate semla year-round, often demanding them after meals, in the evenings, or sometimes even in the middle of the night. Not content with the pastry as it was, he preferred it served in a bowl of hot milk, a preparation called hetväg. It wasn't enough to eat it. He wanted to savor it, soften it, melt it into something transcendent. His obsession became so well known that it sparked quiet concern among those around him. Court physicians warned him of his increasing weight and the pressure his gluttony was putting on his health. Yet their cautions fell on deaf ears. The king was not a tyrant. He didn't rage or punish his staff. But he had a stubborn streak when it came to his pleasures. Perhaps because he had so little say in the realm of politics, food became his domain, the one realm in which he ruled absolutely. Behind closed doors, some members of the nobility whispered of the king's eccentricity. They mocked his carving hobby. Adolf Fredrik often spent his time alone in his chambers, whittling small wooden figures, and laughed at his lack of political backbone. Yet even his critics admitted he was a gentle man, a family man, and a father who adored his children. He wasn't mad in the traditional sense. There were no rants, no tyrannical edicts. But there was something deeply unbalanced in how he filled the void of power with food, with sweetness, with comfort. Over the years, as his belly grew rounder and his gait slower, the whispers turned more serious. Doctors noted symptoms of what may have been chronic indigestion, hypertension, or even early signs of congestive heart failure, all aggravated by his diet. Still, the king paid no mind. Each semla was a moment of pleasure, each feast a temporary escape from a world in which he was king in name only. In a life where so little was truly his, the king claimed his meals with unshakable authority, and as history would later show, that indulgence would become his most enduring and fatal legacy. It was a cold and wind-bitten day, February 12, 1771, when King Adolf Fredrik sat down for what would become the most infamous meal in Swedish royal history. The chill of winter clung to the palace walls, but inside the royal dining hall, warmth radiated from the hearths and from the heavy platters of food being carried in by footmen in polished livery. The king, now 60 years old, had been in frail health for some time. His doctors had cautioned him to avoid overindulgence, but on this day he was in high spirits, and whether out of celebration, restlessness, or sheer habit, he requested a feast of outrageous proportions. It began, as royal meals often did, with the finest delicacies of the time: oysters, lobster, and caviar, delicately arranged and served with generous flutes of chilled champagne. This was not a dinner intended to impress diplomats or entertain nobles. It was a private indulgence, a personal affair of hedonism. The king dined surrounded by a small group of attendants and personal servants, all of whom were accustomed to his erratic but harmless eccentricities. There was laughter, toasts, the clink of silverware and crystal. Yet underneath it all, a sense of unease lingered. There was something excessive even by the king's usual standards. Course after course was served. He consumed sauerkraut and boiled meats, smoked herring, spiced turnips, and roasted game birds, washed down with rich, buttery sauces and more champagne. For most men, any one of these dishes would have sufficed as a full meal. But Adolf Fredrik's appetite was unmatched, and this was not an ordinary evening. His servants, trained not to question the king's wishes, simply complied. Food was placed before him, and food was devoured. But the main event, what would ultimately seal his fate, had not yet arrived. At last, with his belly already heavy from excess, Adolf Fredrik called for his favorite dish, the crown jewel of his culinary obsessions. Semla, not one, not two, but 14 servings of semla, each one served in hot milk, prepared exactly the way he liked it. Soaked, soft, fragrant with cardamom, brimming with sweet almond paste, and topped with clouds of whipped cream. To anyone else, the very idea of eating 14 semla in one sitting might seem absurd, even grotesque. But for the king, it was a ritual of comfort. A moment when the pressures of royal life, even the minimal ones he faced, seemed to dissolve into warm, sweet indulgence. He devoured them slowly, savoring every bite, letting the hot milk soften the pastry as it melted in his mouth. Perhaps he felt a quiet joy. Perhaps he believed this feast would be like any other, a brief escape, followed by rest and digestion. But this meal was different. As the final spoonfuls were taken, those present noted that the king began to appear uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat. He loosened his garments. His breathing grew labored, shallow. A cold sweat broke across his brow. Servants whispered to one another, uncertain whether to intervene or remain silent. The protocols of monarchy were rigid, and even in distress, the king's privacy was to be preserved. Shortly after the feast ended, Adolf Fredrik was helped to his chambers. He complained of severe stomach pain. The discomfort escalated rapidly: bloating, cramping, nausea. Within hours, it became clear that this was no mere indigestion. Some reports from the time describe symptoms consistent with gastrointestinal hemorrhage or a heart attack, perhaps brought on by the sudden immense strain on his already weakened system. Others suggest a stroke, made more likely by his long history of overindulgence and likely hypertension. By the early morning hours of February 13th, the king was dead. The cause, as written in the official records, was vague. Digestive problems. But those close to the court, and later generations of historians, pieced together the details of his final meal. It became legend. A king who ate himself to death. Not metaphorically, but literally. The meal was so excessive, so absurd in scale, that it eclipsed the rest of his reign in the annals of history. What might have passed as royal indulgence in another context became, in this moment, a symbol of unchecked excess. A final act that was both darkly humorous and quietly tragic. A man of gentle spirit and simple pleasures, brought low not by an assassin's blade, not by civil war or betrayal, but by his own unchecked appetite. In the wake of his death, servants and witnesses recounted the details to shocked and sometimes amused ears. The story spread quickly through Sweden and beyond, carried in whispers and newspaper caricatures. It became the stuff of satire, of moral lessons, of tavern jokes. But at its heart, it was a deeply human story, a story of loneliness, compulsion, and a desperate search for joy in the face of powerlessness. Adolf Frederick, the king who ruled little and influenced less, had made one final, indelible mark on history, not in the halls of government, but at the dinner table. In the aftermath of King Adolf Frederick's bizarre and tragic death, a question lingered like the scent of butter and cardamom in the air. Was this simply a case of poor health and excessive eating? Or was there something deeper, perhaps even darker, about the man who had become a global symbol of gluttony? To some, his death was little more than a grotesque footnote in royal history. But for those who looked closer, the image of a king who died not in battle or scandal, but from the weight of his own appetite, seemed to suggest more than just indulgence. It hinted at something profoundly human, a quiet madness cloaked in sweetness. Adolf Frederick had never been a ruler in the traditional sense. While kings across Europe exercised dominion over armies, lands, and law, Adolf Frederick had been reduced to little more than a ceremonial figurehead under Sweden's constitutional monarchy. The true power rested with the Riksdag and the competing political factions known as the Hats and the Caps. His opinions were rarely requested and almost never followed. Every royal decree required parliamentary approval. Decisions about war, taxation, governance, even appointments within the palace were made without him. He was, in effect, a man placed upon a throne but denied the scepter. This political impotence may have played a much larger role in shaping the king's psychology than historians initially realized. To live under the illusion of grandeur, surrounded by the trappings of power but deprived of its actual exercise, is a torment few can understand. Adolf Frederick was, in many ways, imprisoned in luxury, confined to a palace where every whim was catered to, but where nothing truly mattered that he said or did. In such a world, it's not difficult to see how a person might withdraw into smaller pleasures, into hobbies, into obsessions, into compulsions. And so, while other kings led armies or enacted reforms, Adolf Frederick carved wooden figurines alone in his study. He read books, he doted on his children, and above all, he ate. Food became his dominion, the one realm over which no parliament held sway. No politician could legislate how many pastries he could consume or how much butter he could slather on his bread. In the absence of power, pleasure became power, and eventually, it became his identity. To his detractors, he was a man of weak will and gluttonous excess. To his admirers, he was a gentle soul with no taste for cruelty. A man who had not let the poison of politics infect his heart. But all agreed, there was something deeply unbalanced about him. Not mad in the sense of lunacy or rage, but in the quieter, more tragic sense of someone who could not bear the emptiness of his own insignificance. Modern psychology might describe Adolf Fredrick's behavior as a form of compensatory indulgence. Stripped of agency in his public life, he sought control and affirmation through consumption. The repetition of ritual, eating the same favorite dessert, carved the same figures in solitude, offered a sense of order in a life otherwise marked by political chaos and personal impotence. His pleasure wasn't purely hedonistic. It was existential. It filled a void. Contemporary accounts of his behavior offer glimpses of this internal struggle. Some courtiers described moments of melancholy in the king, long silences during meetings, a tendency to stare out windows rather than engage in discussion, abrupt changes in mood. Others recalled his delight at receiving sweets from foreign dignitaries, as if gifts of chocolate or spiced pastries carried more emotional weight than the gravest matters of state. These small anecdotes, often dismissed as charming eccentricities, now seem to sketch the outline of a man quietly unraveling. What makes his case so fascinating is that it doesn't fit neatly into any box. He was not a tyrant, not a lunatic, not even particularly vain. He was not known for cruelty or ambition. He was, rather, the picture of gentleness, almost childlike in his enthusiasms and habits. But beneath that exterior, one can sense a dangerous imbalance. The same man who would spend hours carving toys also ignored all warnings from his physicians. The man who smiled at his servants and treated them kindly would gorge himself to the point of collapse without a second thought. His compulsions weren't acts of arrogance. They were acts of desperation. The line between eccentricity and madness has always been thin, especially among royalty. And in Adolf Fredrick's case, the boundary may have blurred long before that final fatal meal. He was a man caught between two worlds, the illusion of supreme authority and the reality of complete powerlessness. And so he ruled where he could, over his appetite, his table, and his fleeting moments of joy. When he died, some in the court were genuinely heartbroken. He had been a beloved husband and father, and those closest to him knew he harbored no evil in his heart. But there was also a quiet, unspoken sense of relief. For in truth, Adolf Fredrick had not been truly alive, not in the sense of purpose, of passion, or of influence, for many years. He had drifted slowly and sweetly toward a death of his own making, not out of malice or madness, but out of longing for agency, for comfort, for a life that mattered. And so, while his death may seem absurd to us now, almost comical in its excess, it was, in a deeper sense, the final chapter of a quiet tragedy. A man who found himself irrelevant in the grand story of his country, who tried to write his own ending, one spoonful at a time. When the news of King Adolf Fredrick's death was first announced, it was delivered with the traditional formality and sorrow reserved for the passing of a monarch. The royal court went into mourning, black drapes were hung, bells tolled, and somber ceremonies were planned to honor the late king. But even in these earliest hours, a peculiar tension was growing beneath the surface, one that would soon eclipse the sorrow and transform his death into a source of ridicule, satire, and whispered amusement across Sweden and beyond. At first, the official cause of death, digestive problems, was vague enough to preserve some royal dignity. But secrets in the royal court rarely stay buried. especially when servants, courtiers, and physicians have all witnessed something so unusual, so grotesquely memorable. The details of his final meal began to leak, one morsel at a time. And as they did, the reaction from the public shifted rapidly from solemn respect to disbelief, mockery, and even morbid delight. People could hardly believe it. A king dying from eating too much? Not from poison, assassination, or war, but from dessert. It was a story that seemed almost designed to deflate the majesty of monarchy. 14 sweet rolls, boiled milk, lobster and caviar. Champagne. A stomach pushed far beyond its natural limit. It sounded less like the end of a king's life and more like a punchline from a tavern joke. And that's exactly what it became. Satirists and pamphlet writers seized the moment like wolves around a wounded deer. In an age when political speech was often suppressed, comedy and satire became the tools of dissent. Cartoonists in Stockholm began drawing images of a rotund king toppling from his chair with a semla in each hand. Anonymous writers crafted biting poems that mocked not just the king, but the gluttony and decadence of the aristocracy as a whole. The event became a perfect metaphor for everything wrong with the monarchy. Out of touch, indulgent, bloated, literally and figuratively. One poem, circulated in secret and later published in underground broadsheets, referred to Adolf Frederick as the Pastry King, a monarch who ruled not with iron, but with whipped cream. Another likened his demise to the fall of Rome, an empire brought low, not by enemies at the gates, but by the decadence of its rulers. The humor was often cruel, but it struck a chord with a population weary of privilege, bureaucracy, and political stagnation. If ever there was proof that the monarchy had become a farce, this was it. Even foreign observers found the situation impossible to ignore. In the salons of Paris and the parlors of London, diplomats and aristocrats chuckled over the peculiar case of the Swedish king who had, quite literally, eaten himself to death. Voltaire himself reportedly commented on it in private letters, viewing it as yet another example of how detached Europe's royal houses had become from reason, moderation, and Enlightenment values. In an age increasingly obsessed with science, philosophy, and civic reform, Adolf Frederick's death seemed like a relic of another time, a final absurdity in the age of absolute monarchy. But not everyone laughed. Within the palace, his family mourned deeply. His wife, Queen Louisa Ulrika of Prussia, was devastated, not only by the loss of her husband, but by the humiliating way his death was being portrayed. Louisa had always harbored ambitions to restore real power to the throne, and now that dream was irreparably stained. Her husband had become a caricature, and by extension, so had she. Their children were forced to grow up in the shadow of their father's notorious appetite, their own public images shaped by the legacy of semlore and satire. Some conservative voices in the government and church tried to push back against the tide of mockery. They insisted that his death was being misrepresented, that it was not gluttony, but illness, not indulgence, but misfortune. They begged the public to remember the king for his kindness, his gentleness, his peaceful reign. But their efforts were in vain. The story had taken on a life of its own, and no royal decree could restrain it. It became folklore. In rural towns, children were told the tale of the king who ate too much, often as a warning against greed. In cities, the anniversary of his death became an excuse for jokes, reenactments, even mock banquets where people would try, and fail, to eat as much as he had. What began as a tragedy had curdled into farce, then into tradition. And yet, beneath the laughter, there was something else too, something unspoken but universally understood. His death was ridiculous, yes, but it was also strangely sad. It spoke to a deep emptiness. the kind that luxury can't fill and power can't cure. It was a warning not only about food, but about the human desire to escape from reality into excess. And that warning echoed louder than any church bell at his funeral. As time passed, the court returned to its routines. The Riksdag resumed its endless debates. A new king was crowned. But the memory of Adolf Fredrik's final hours lingered like a stain on the velvet of history. An absurd, unforgettable ending to a quiet and powerless life. A man who had no influence in his realm had become, in death, a symbol recognized across the world. Not for his reforms, not for his legacy, but for his appetite. Today, centuries after his death, King Adolf Fredrik remains a historical curiosity. His name etched not into grand monuments of conquest or sweeping reforms, but into the soft, sweet folds of a cream-filled pastry. In Sweden and across the world, he is remembered less for the years he spent on the throne and more for the moment he fell from it. His final act not one of statecraft or ceremony, but of culinary excess. His legacy is not carved in stone, but baked fresh every year in bakeries across the country. Each winter, as Shrove Tuesday approaches, the traditional day before Lent, also known as Fettisdagen in Sweden, the nation begins preparing for its most indulgent seasonal treat, the semla. The streets fill with the warm scent of cardamom and sweet almond paste. Cafes and bakeries proudly display the delicacy in their windows, each one slightly different, each one promising the same soft, pillowy comfort that once brought joy and demise to a king. Families gather to enjoy the pastries together. Co-workers bring them into the office. Children lick whipped cream from their fingers. And somewhere in the laughter and tradition, the name Adolf Fredrik re-emerges, not in reverence, but in gentle amusement. The semla has become more than a dessert in Sweden. It is a cultural icon, a national indulgence, and for many, a light-hearted annual reminder of the king who loved them far too much. People still tell the story, how he ate 14 of them in one sitting, after a feast fit for 5 men, and died hours later. Historians continue to debate the exact cause of his death. Was it truly the food? Did he suffer a stroke? Heart failure? Gastrointestinal rupture? The medical specifics are lost to time. But the symbolic truth remains. His appetite consumed him, and his final joy became his undoing. This legacy, strange, humorous, and tragic, has cemented Adolf Fredrik's place in history in a way few monarchs achieve. Most kings are remembered for what they conquered, what they built, or what they destroyed. Adolf Fredrik is remembered for what he consumed. His life has become a parable, not unlike the ancient myths in which men are undone by their own desires. Like King Midas and his golden touch, Adolf Fredrik was overwhelmed by the very thing he cherished most. But unlike Midas, there was no magic, just too much food, too little restraint, and perhaps too much sadness behind it all. And yet, despite the mockery and the legend, there is something deeply human in his story. He was not a villain. He did not order executions or lead his people into ruinous wars. He was not tyrannical or feared. He was, by most accounts, a gentle man, kind to his family, courteous to his staff, more interested in wood carving and pastries than politics and power. In many ways, he was a king who did not want to rule. Perhaps he understood that the throne he sat on had no real power, that he was a symbol rather than a sovereign. Perhaps, knowing that, he chose to retreat inward, to find joy in what he could control. His carving knives, his dinner table, his dessert. In this way, Adolf Fredrik's life and death offer a unique window into the human soul, not just of a king, but of anyone who has ever tried to fill a void with pleasure. His story speaks to the quiet desperation that can grow in lives of isolation, even if those lives are gilded with gold. He reminds us that madness does not always come with violence or rage. Sometimes it comes with silence, with sugar, with soft bread and warm milk. The legacy of Adolf Fredrik is carried on not only in the stories and the satire, but in every semla lovingly baked and devoured in the cold Swedish winter. In every child who giggles at the tale of the king who couldn't stop eating. In every adult who smiles knowingly and says, "Just one more," before reaching for another. And so he lives on, not in shame, not in glory, but in the strange in-between that only true legends occupy. A man both mocked and remembered, pitied and beloved. A king whose throne was fragile, but whose appetite was eternal. Long after the feasts are over and the court has fallen silent, his tale remains, a story of indulgence, loneliness, and the bittersweet hunger that lives in us all.